The Roman Empire. For centuries, it was the greatest civilization the world had ever seen, ruling a vast territory from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt. Its legions seemed invincible, its engineering was legendary, and its laws became the foundation for Western society. And then it fell. The story we're all taught is a simple one: barbarians at the gates. A declining empire, battered by wave after wave of invading tribes, finally buckled under the pressure. But what if that's not the whole story? Modern historians now see a much more complex picture, involving everything from climate change to plagues. But what if the most corrosive poison wasn't an external force, but an internal one? What if the greatest empire in the world wasn't conquered, but was hollowed out from within by the very people at the top? This is the story of how the greed and pride of a tiny, powerful elite, the 1% of Rome, helped set the stage for the spectacular collapse of a civilization. This is the story of an inside job. Section 1. The Poison of Greed. Economic sabotage. To understand how Rome rotted from the inside, we first have to follow the money. Because before the walls of the city were breached, its treasury was already being looted by some of its own leaders. As new territories were conquered, unprecedented riches flowed back to Rome: gold from Spain, grain from Egypt, and treasures from Greece. But this immense wealth didn't flow to the Roman people, or even entirely to the state. It began to accumulate in the hands of a few hundred senatorial families, who increasingly saw the empire not as a republic to be served, but as a personal bank account to be plundered. One of their primary tools, or at least a tool they benefited from, was the debasement of the currency. It's a simple but devastating trick. The Roman denarius, a silver coin, was the bedrock of the economy. But as emperors and the state needed more and more money to fund a massive army and administrative costs, they began to debase the currency. They would mint new coins with the same face value, but with less and less silver, mixing it with cheaper metals like copper. This was a short-sighted solution to pay soldiers and meet expenses, but its effect was catastrophic. As the coins became less valuable, merchants raised their prices to compensate. This triggered runaway inflation, and by 265 AD, prices had skyrocketed by 1,000% across the empire. The life savings of ordinary Roman citizens, shopkeepers, craftsmen, and soldiers were wiped out. Trust in the monetary system collapsed, and many people resorted to bartering just to survive. Meanwhile, the super-rich often insulated themselves. Their wealth wasn't just in coins, it was in land. The elite owned vast agricultural estates called latifundia, which were essentially self-sufficient kingdoms. On these estates, they used labor to produce much of what they needed, effectively detaching themselves from the very economy that was imploding for everyone else. And then there were the taxes. As the state's financial crisis deepened, the tax burden fell disproportionately on the poor and the middle class. The wealthiest landowners often used their political power to gain exemptions or simply evade their share. This created a death spiral. As tax revenues dried up, the state had to print more worthless money, which caused more inflation, which drove more of the wealthy to abandon the system. The economic engine of the empire sputtered and died, hollowed out by the greed of a few who benefited from the chaos. Section 2. The Cancer of Pride. Political instability. If greed was the poison that sickened the empire's economy, then pride was the cancer that devoured its political soul. The Roman Republic was founded on the idea of shared power and civic duty. But by the late Republic, those ideals were a distant memory. Power became a zero-sum game played by ambitious generals and senators who saw the state as a prize to be won, not a trust to be upheld. The unwritten rules of political conduct were shattered, and violence became a standard tool to achieve power. This cult of personality and pride reached its peak during the infamous crisis enormous crisis of the 3rd century. In a chaotic 50-year span, more than 26 men claimed the title of emperor, with most meeting a violent end. These were emperors and would-be emperors, generals backed by armies loyal not to Rome, but to them personally. They would march on the capital, seize power, and then be challenged by another ambitious general. The result was a near-constant state of civil war. These internal wars were arguably more destructive than many barbarian invasions. Legions were pulled from the frontiers to fight other legions, leaving the borders exposed. Cities were sacked, farmlands were destroyed, and the population was terrorized, not by foreign enemies, but by Roman soldiers fighting for the ego of their commanders. This endless cycle of political instability meant there was no consistent leadership, no long-term planning, and no way to address the empire's mounting problems. The emperor's throne became a death sentence, and the Senate was reduced to a rubber stamp for whichever general held the most swords. This arrogance wasn't new, of course. It was a disease that had been festering for centuries. Just look at Julius Caesar, a man so convinced of his own importance that he famously ignored dozens of warnings about the Ides of March, believing he was above the petty squabbles of lesser men. His pride led to his assassination and plunged the Republic into another devastating series of civil wars. This was the ultimate expression of the elite, hubris. Their personal ambition and quest for glory became more important than the stability and even the survival of the Roman state itself. They were willing to burn the entire empire to the ground just for a chance to rule over its ashes. Mid-roll CTA building. A stable civilization is hard work, and as we're seeing, it can be undone when powerful people lose sight of the common good. Keeping this channel growing takes work too, but it's a lot easier. If you're finding this history compelling, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It helps us keep uncovering these hidden stories from the past. Now, back to the fall of Rome. Section 3. The sickness of self-interest. Social decay. As the rich got richer and the politicians fought their endless wars, a third sickness was spreading through Roman society. A profound loss of what the Romans themselves called civic virtue. The great historian Edward Gibbon famously argued that a primary cause of Rome's fall was this decay of public spirit. In the early Republic, patriotism was built on a strong sense of shared interest in the state. Citizens were expected to participate in public life, to serve, and to prioritize the common good. But under the late Empire, this ideal faded. For many in the 1%, public service was no longer a duty. It was a burden to be avoided. The senatorial class, who should have been the stewards of Roman society, began a slow retreat from public life. They increasingly abandoned the chaotic city of Rome for their luxurious, fortified villas in the countryside. A Roman aristocrat named Rutilius Nematianus, for example, wrote a famous poem about leaving the turmoil of Rome to check on his private estates in Gaul. This physical retreat was also a psychological one. Surrounded by opulence, they became detached from the struggles of the common Roman. While the state crumbled and invaders threatened the borders, they hosted lavish parties and indulged in unbelievable luxuries. They created a bubble of wealth and privilege, seemingly indifferent to the decay outside their walls. This wasn't just apathy, it was a conscious decision to put personal comfort ahead of the empire's survival. The sense of shared responsibility that held the vast, diverse empire together simply evaporated. Why should a common soldier fight and die for an empire whose leaders had already abandoned it? Why should a farmer pay crippling taxes to a state that gave him nothing in return? The social contract was broken. The elite no longer just led the people, they exploited them. The complex web of trust, duty, and shared identity that made the empire function was shredded by the self-interest of the 1%, the climax, the point of no return. So when did it all become irreversible? While the final fall of the Western Roman Empire is dated to 476 AD, many historians believe the fatal wounds were struck centuries earlier. The crisis of the 3rd century was the perfect storm where all three of these poisons, greed, pride, and self-interest, converged with other disasters like plague and foreign invasions to mortally wound the empire. The economic sabotage from currency debasement had led to hyperinflation. The political pride of competing generals had plunged the empire into constant civil war, draining the military and the treasury. And the social decay caused by the elite's retreat meant there was little collective will left to fix the problems. By the end of this 50-year crisis, the Roman Empire was a hollowed-out shell. It was financially bankrupt, militarily exhausted, and politically broken. The recovery under later emperors like Diocletian and Constantine was significant and did stabilize things for more than a century, but it couldn't undo the deep-seated damage. They could divide the empire and move the capital, but they couldn't resurrect the corrupted foundations of the ruling class. This is why, when the so-called barbarian invasions intensified in the late 4th and 5th centuries, the Western Empire shattered so easily. The invaders weren't pushing against the mighty, unified Rome of legend. They were pushing against a house that was already collapsing on itself. The barbarians didn't conquer Rome alone. They were simply the final force to kick in the door of a building that was already condemned. Conclusion. So, was the fall of Rome an assassination by foreign invaders? No, it was more like a slow suicide with many contributing factors. But a key part of that suicide was orchestrated by its own ruling class. Through their unchecked greed, their narcissistic pride, and their profound self-interest, a powerful few helped dismantle the very systems that had made Rome great. They profited from an economy they had helped debase. They tore the state apart with civil wars for personal glory, and they abandoned their civic duties for personal comfort. As the historian Edward Gibbon wrote, the whole thing eventually yielded to the pressure of its own weight. Modern scholarship agrees that the fall was caused by a complex interplay of factors, including military defeats, climate change, disease, and external invasions. But the story of Rome's collapse still serves as a timeless, chilling warning. It shows that a grave threat to any civilization can come not just from external enemies, but from internal decay and the unchecked ambition of a powerful few. It raises a question we must continue to ask ourselves today. Is a society defined by the strength of its walls or by the character of its leaders? What do you think? Was the fall inevitable, or could it have been stopped? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.